Let's take a look at opacity. What opacity is it allows you to make things either completely see-through or partially see-through. And to apply this in CSS, we use the opacity element. Now this includes images, this includes text, includes full elements. What you do have to remember though is if you have a parent element with a 50% opacity, so it's half see-through, all of its children are going to be half see-through. And you can't raise the opacity of the children back up to, let's say, 100%, so that they are not see-through at all. And that's one of the challenges of using opacity. Instead of styling the parent element to have 50% opacity, web developers will quite often just use a background image, set it to repeat, and that'll just be a PNG, and it will have 50% opacity. This way all the text is still shown up nice and strong, and you don't have to kind of squint to see what you're looking at. So opacity, or in Internet Explorer, you use filter, alpha, opacity, and then your value. Now this is tricky because Internet Explorer doesn't like to agree on a lot of things. But typically, your value, which is what your opacity is going to be, is the number that will represent your opacity. And typically that's from 0 to 1. So to apply a 50% opacity, we would declare a class or an ID. We use opacity 0.5, that's 50%. This is just changing the decimal over to a percent. We can't use percents though, so always use a decimal. And then in Internet Explorer, we're going to use filter alpha opacity is equal to 50. In Internet Explorer, your number will always be between 0 and 100. And in this sense, you can think of it as a percent without the percent sign. So you can have filter alpha opacity could be, let's say you wanted 75%. You could write it like that, but just delete the percent sign, and that works perfectly. Now I suggest always use both properties. It's a little bit more typing. It's not very difficult though. It can be a little bit tricky to remember the Internet Explorer version. And in the event that you're asking why Internet Explorer does that, nobody really knows. It's just kind of one of the things about the internet that a lot of web developers don't like, is that Internet Explorer tries to be very different. And in that sense, it makes our job as a web developer a lot more difficult than it needs to be. So always use both properties, because if opacity 0.5 doesn't work in Internet Explorer, then filter alpha opacity will. And the goal is to have your web page look the exact same in all 5 of the major browsers. That's Internet Explorer, Opera, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. So just to take a look at another demo here, we have 2 images. Let me close that property. That's old HTML. This is XHTML, self-closing tag. So we have an image, star, set our width, alt is equal to star and star. The first one we set our opacity to half, 0.5. We also set the filter alpha opacity to 50. Same thing as 0.5. And what this would display, our first star image is half see-through, and our second image not see-through at all. And that's opacity.